Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar recording on how to build a backyard compost. My name is Shannon. I work with the Northeast Kingdom Waste Management District here in Lyndonville, Vermont. My contact information is down in the corner below. While today is a recording, I want to invite everyone to send me questions after you watch the recording, anything that you don't feel like has been addressed and you still really want to know the answer. Please feel free to reach out to me with the email below, outreach@nekwmd.org. So let's begin. Today we're going to cover a lot of different things, but for the most part we're going to review and discuss Vermont's Act 148, which is our Universal Recycling and Composting Law. We're going to talk about some benefits of composting, how to choose your ideal setup in your compost system, how to build and maintain a productive compost pile, and how to troubleshoot any problems. We're also going to talk here and there about some different options you have for managing your food scraps that aren't backyard composting, but the majority of this workshop is going to focus on having a productive and active backyard compost that doesn't produce any odors or attract any animals. I really like this image here on the right, playing off a different popular phrase, which I'm not going to state. It says compost happens, and it's just a great reminder that compost naturally happens. And so decomposition is going to happen to our food waste no matter what, but when we control the process of decomposition by putting in enough carbon and nitrogen, making sure there's water and oxygen for our micro and macroorganisms, then we speed up the process and make it as fast and efficient as possible. So to begin, let's take a look at Vermont's Universal Recycling and Composting Law, Act 148. This law passed unanimously through Vermont's legislature in 2012, and has had a phased-in approach to different landfill bans. Starting in 2015 with a landfill ban on common household recyclables, and now moving to a landfill ban on all food waste. And so food waste from institutions like restaurants and schools, but also food waste from our own homes. And so the law also outlines this food recovery hierarchy and really helps us think about the ways that we can reduce our food waste that aren't just composting. Like, to begin, we should all look at source reduction, and that could mean a lot of different things depending on whether or not you're an institution or a household. But thinking about the household, that could look like things like making a list when you go grocery shopping. So you're not just picking out things that you don't need or maybe you actually aren't going to eat before it goes bad. It also looks like, once you bring home from the grocery store, placing it strategically in your refrigerator so that all the perishable foods are right up front so that they don't get lost somewhere. Even things like placing milk into the body of the fridge rather than in the door could really help to increase the lifespan of that milk, since the door is where there's the most temperature change from opening and closing the fridge. So a lot of different things you can do, well, just between the grocery store and in your own kitchen for how you think about organizing your food to make less waste. Once we think about source reduction, any food that we have that we don't eat that's still wholesome for people, that can be fed to people, should be fed to people, which on a household level is a little difficult because we may not be able to donate our leftovers, but certainly from institutions like universities and schools and potentially restaurants and retailers, there's a lot of food that can be donated. And in Vermont, we do a really great job with that. Since the passing of Act 148, even though not all food scraps are banned yet, we still have seen a really great uptick in the amount of food donation that happens all across the state. And so food that can't be fed to people, but maybe is still wholesome enough for animals, certainly should go to animals. And so we see that a lot in the Northeast Kingdom, where a lot of our compost programs will actually feed the food scraps to chickens before placing all that food scraps into a large windrow compost pile. There are some considerations for feeding pigs in the state of Vermont. They certainly can eat food scraps from a farmer's household, but farmers aren't allowed to, say, go to restaurants and collect food scraps from establishments. That is sort of against the regulations in the state. And so after we've thought about how to do source reduction, feed people, feed animals, then we can think about composting our waste or anaerobically digesting it for some type of methane generation. And if we can't do that, we can process the food waste for energy recovery, which in Vermont does include landfilling the waste and then capturing the methane that is produced from it. So is composting really that important? We know in Vermont, we are lucky enough to have very specific information about what our waste looks like, not only from the residential side of things, but also from the industrial side of things. But this pie chart that I have here is 2018 data, and it is specifically from residential Vermont. And so a company was hired to basically sort out trash as it arrived to transfer stations and landfills throughout the state. And they found that a good portion of our waste is organic material, which is anything that could be decomposed, and paper, which is also a compostable material. And so, that's roughly 52%, a little over half of our landfill waste stream is material that could be captured as a resource and turned into compost. And we know that when we throw this material away into the landfill, as it decomposes in the landfill, which does not have oxygen, it has anaerobic bacteria breaking things down very slowly, that methane is generated from the landfill. In Vermont, we do capture that landfill gas and generate electricity with it, but we never actually know how efficient those systems are. And so we can expect that some of that landfill gas is bypassing that gas capturing system and is going into our atmosphere. And we also know that as material breaks down in a landfill and releases moisture, that moisture from the food scraps is combining with the toxins in our other waste that's in the landfill. And it's creating a leachate that has this whole host of chemicals in it. The leachate needs to be pumped out of the landfill and brought to a wastewater treatment facility. And these wastewater treatment facilities are more designed to handle wastewater from our own homes and from businesses and restaurants, not necessarily wastewater that has heavy metals and PFOAs in it. And so it is much organic material that is possible that we can keep out of the landfill. We know that impact is very great with decreasing the amount of landfill gas that we ourselves are generating by the material that we throw into the landfill. And so this is just a little information about the impacts of how much organic material, how much food waste we're throwing into the trash and leaf and yard waste, and how much that actually produces landfill gas. So just a little more information about food waste in the United States. We know it is excessive and that 40% of all food waste produced in the US is wasted, and that's about 133 billion pounds. And to think that's about 1,200 calories per person per day. That's a lot of wasted resources, not only the nutritional value it could provide to people, but the water, the land, the labor, the transportation, everything that goes into getting food to people. And we know that it's expensive. In the retail world, about $161 billion is the price tag of wasted food. But in our own homes, for a family of 4, the price tag is closer to $1,500. And so thinking about that number and connecting it back to source reduction, how can we reduce the amount of food waste we're producing and try to cut down that average number of $1,500 per a household of 4? It's hard to think about how maybe in my own life, how much money do I spend a month on food that is wasted. It's really difficult to think about it in that way, but that might help you think about ways to cut back on food waste. And as we just discussed, we know that food waste is environmentally harmful, that it makes up roughly 20% of landfill weight in the country. I would say it's actually a little bit more, like 25%. This is the average I've seen. And we know that that produces methane, which is 21 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Food waste, though, is also an opportunity because we can really address food insecurity, we can build up our soils, and we can really change the way that we think about food, maybe ugly foods, and really realize that these are all resources, regardless of how it maybe looks. The nutritional value is always still there. So 10 reasons to compost. Just a quick overview. We know compost is really great for reducing waste, and we know that it can help to save us money, but it also does a great job improving plant growth, improving soil fertility, reducing soil erosion, really building up the soil structure, allowing it to retain more nutrients and to store more carbon in the soil. And by doing all of this, we really can build community resiliency and power by ensuring that our own community has nutritious food and keeping those nutrients in that community, not sending those nutrients to a landfill. And so, for whatever reason, you've decided that you want to compost. Maybe you already do compost and you're looking to learn a little bit more about it today. I hope I can do that for you. Or maybe you're still trying to decide if you want to compost, if that's what's going to work best for you. So now I have a little 10-minute video that I would like to share. And after the video, we're going to dive deep into some of the topics that are covered in it, and we're really going to break down the information a little more, no pun intended.
Hello and welcome from the Old Stone House Museum in Brownington, Vermont, for today's video on how to build a backyard compost pile. My name is Shannon. I work with the Northeast Kingdom Waste Management District here in beautiful northeastern Vermont. And I'm excited to show you how building a backyard compost with food scraps from your kitchen is a great way to save money on trash disposal while reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, since you'll be removing methane-generating food scraps from your trash and instead using that resource to make a nutrient-rich soil amendment for your lawn or garden. In Vermont and in the rest of the U.S., up to 25% of the average household's trash is food waste and other organic material that can be composted. So many of us have all the ingredients we need to compost right in our own homes. When you are ready to start composting, it can be exciting and a little bit intimidating when you see all the information there is out there about compost recipes, bin designs, maintaining the compost pile, and more. The goal of this video is to provide you with the information you need to feel confident experimenting with a backyard compost. So let's begin.
Before starting our compost pile, we first need to choose a good location in the backyard. Choose a location with well-drained soil that is convenient and accessible any time of the year. Wherever you choose to have your compost, it is recommended to take some animal proofing measures, such as containing your compost in a bin and reinforcing that bin with hardware cloth, which can be purchased at many hardware stores. As for bin designs, there are many options you can choose from. You can build your own using pallets or chicken wire, or you can purchase a bin at many hardware stores and solid waste districts in Vermont. Whatever design you choose, make sure it allows air and moisture to flow throughout the pile. I do not have any hardware cloth today, so after prepping the compost location by removing any grass, sod, sticks, or twigs, I'm ready to build my compost. To begin, I am building the first layer of the compost using yard waste, including dried leaves, mulch hay, and small sticks. This initial layer is important as it will promote airflow and balance moisture as the pile breaks down. I want my initial layer to be about 10 to 12 inches tall. Never start a compost pile by placing food scraps directly on the ground. This would be an invitation for burrowing animals to come and have a tasty meal.
With my bottom layer ready, I can now begin adding food scraps to my compost pile. So let's take a minute and talk about composting ingredients. You may have heard that compost works best with the ideal carbon-nitrogen ratio of 30:1. If you're like me, hearing about a 30:1 carbon-nitrogen ratio sounds a little bit confusing. How would I know if the ingredients I have will help me to achieve that ratio? You may have also heard about compost recipes using browns and greens to build a compost pile. Let's talk about how the browns and the greens relate to the 30:1 carbon-nitrogen ratio. Composting browns refers to ingredients that are a source of carbon for our compost pile. They typically are dry and woody and therefore promote moisture and airflow throughout the compost pile. These ingredients include things like dried leaves, mulch hay, sawdust, wood chips and shavings, and shredded paper. Composting greens refer to ingredients that are a source of nitrogen. Greens are typically wet and heavy ingredients that include food scraps, like fruit and veggie peels, eggshells, coffee grounds, bread and pastas, as well as fresh manures. There are things you want to avoid putting into your compost, including meat, bones, and dairy. While these materials do decompose, they take a very large compost pile to break down fast and effectively. In your backyard compost, they would produce odors that would attract animal visitors. Now let's get back to the importance of the carbon and nitrogen ratio. Carbon and nitrogen are very important in our compost pile as they help to support healthy and active microbial populations. It's the bacteria and the fungus in our compost pile that do the hard work of decomposition. So basically, I like to think that when we build a compost pile, we're trying to build the perfect environment for our composting microorganisms to break down our food scraps as quickly as possible. While we may not know the carbon or nitrogen content of any of our composting ingredients, we know we can achieve the 30:1 carbon-nitrogen ratio by building our compost pile with roughly 3 times the amount of browns than greens. So, for every gallon of food scraps we add to our compost, we'll want to add roughly 3 gallons of wood chips, leaves, hay, or other browns. This 1:3 ratio will not only help to support healthy microbes in our compost, but will also promote optimal moisture and airflow as material breaks down. Now that we've reviewed composting ingredients and recipe, and the importance of carbon and nitrogen to our composting microorganisms, we're ready to build our compost pile.
Since we have our bottom layer of compost ready, we can now add our first layer of green food scraps. Any layer of food scraps should be no more than 6 inches tall. Next, we want to add roughly 3 times as much browns material to completely cover the food scraps so they are no longer visible. Covering the food scraps completely will ensure minimal odors and animal visitors. Continue building your layers, making sure to stick to the 1:3 volume ratio of greens and browns. By layering your pile with this ratio, you're ensuring that the composting microorganisms have access to all the nutrients they need while promoting proper moisture and airflow throughout the pile. While not a necessary ingredient, I was given the gift of fresh manure from 2 friendly horses, so I'm going to add the manure to the pile before my final brown layer. Animal manures are great for jump-starting your compost pile and can help mitigate odors. After my final brown layer, I'm adding a few gallons of water to my pile to ensure there is enough moisture to support the composting microbes. As your compost breaks down, food scraps will release moisture, so if you live in a wet climate like Vermont, you will not need to add water to your compost often, but you'll want to add it to a new pile.
Every time I add material to my compost, I'll make sure to stick to the 1:3 greens to browns volume ratio. Notice how, to start, I built a medium-sized compost. I did this because it's the center of the compost pile where microorganisms are most active. If our compost pile is too small, there will not be enough material to support active microbial populations. With this medium-sized compost, as microorganisms become active in the center of the pile, they will generate heat, which will speed up decomposition. The larger the compost, the more heat it will generate, and the faster materials will break down. In about 1 month, I'll want to check on my pile to see if it's breaking down, and to turn my pile to promote airflow and move any food scraps on the outer edge of the pile into the center. If you feel heat coming from your pile, you know it is active and working. Now, if you do not feel heat coming from your pile, or it's causing odors, you know that something is not working optimally with your compost. Odors are a telltale sign that your compost pile too wet? Optimal moisture levels in a compost pile are about 50 to 60%, like a wrung out sponge. If it is too wet, fresh air and oxygen cannot flow through the pile to the microorganisms. Anaerobic, oxygen-loving bacteria will quickly die and be replaced with stinky anaerobic bacteria. If it is too wet, turn the pile to reintroduce oxygen and add more brown materials to get the desired moisture level. Likewise, if your compost pile is too dry, the microorganisms will dry out and die. So, if your compost does not appear active and is dry, simply adding water will reinvigorate the microbial populations. If you're experiencing issues with your compost, take a good look at your compost recipe and experiment with adjusting the ingredients while sticking to the 1 to 3 greens to browns volume ratio. Now, you may be wondering how long it will take to turn your food scraps into a usable compost. Typically, if you start your compost in the spring and add materials throughout the summer, by the fall, you will have a finished compost. Even though this compost looks finished, there are still nutrients being processed by the microorganisms. So we can remove this finished compost from the pile and allow it to cure in another bin or under a tarp for a few months. Then, in the spring, it will be ready to add to your lawn or garden. Today, we covered a lot of things, so to recap, we discussed how typically everyone creates food waste, and backyard composting is a great way to keep food waste out of the trash and to make a nutrient-rich soil amendment. We learned that regardless of what bin design you choose or where you choose to build your compost, you want to consider how to promote optimal moisture and airflow throughout your compost pile and how to keep away animals. We talked a lot about composting ingredients and the importance of carbon and nitrogen for our composting microorganisms. These microorganisms do the work of decomposition, so we want to do whatever we can to promote healthy and active microbial populations in our compost. Our composting microbes are most active when they get the ideal amounts of carbon, nitrogen, air, and water. If your compost pile is not breaking down or is causing an odor, take a look at your composting ingredients and adjust your recipe to get the desired outcome. I hope you enjoyed today's video on how to build a backyard compost. Now get outside and experiment with one of your own.
So I hope you enjoyed that video. I made that at the beautiful Old Stone House Museum in Brownington, Vermont. Thank you so much for allowing me to visit and to build a compost in your beautiful system. It was such a lovely day. Anyone who hasn't been there before should totally check it out. It is a piece of Vermont history that is just gorgeous. So back to composting. This slide is just a reminder that composting and decomposition, well, decomposition I should say, happens all around us. I use this example of a leaf falling from a tree quite a bit when I'm in schools talking about decomposition, right? We know that when leaves fall from trees, they don't exist forever. But what is actually breaking that down? We know it's the microorganisms, the fungus, the worms. Decomposition is happening thanks to a lot of different organisms. And it's when we control the decomposition of things that we call the process of composting. So we control the decomposition of our food scraps and our leaf and yard waste to create a soil amendment that we actually can use to provide nutrients to our food, in our lawn, our garden, whatever we use it on. And we control the decomposition in a lot of ways by what ingredients we put in, how large we build our pile, how well we promote aeration and moisture flow throughout the pile, and how we mitigate pests and odors that may attract those pests. And so we can control the decomposition in all these ways to speed up decomposition and produce a great compost. And we're going to talk about how to do that. So first, we're going to talk about selecting a compost system. This is where I get a lot of questions. You know, once you decide you're going to compost and you think about how to collect food scraps in your own home, you know, a lot of people choose to have a container with a lid either on their counter or under the sink, maybe in a temperature controlled place like the garage, having a 5-gallon bucket with a lid. You always want to have a lid, even if you're taking out food scraps just every few days. But once you collect those food scraps and you think about what type of brown materials you have available to you, and you decide that you want to try composting, the next biggest question is, what type of system do I want? So in the state of Vermont, the Agency of Natural Resources says that it's best to contain your compost in a bin. And so the first image we have on the upper left is not something we typically advise for just an open pile, but open piles work. You don't need to contain your compost in a bin. I think open piles work best if you have animal manures to mix in, because that'll really add a lot of the microbes, it'll balance out moisture, really help with odors if you have, say, a lot of horse manure to build your compost pile with. But typically, in order to keep animals out, we really want to contain our compost in a bin. And so the image that is surrounded by the orange glow, that is a soil saver. And that is the design that we here in the Northeast Kingdom and a lot of other solid waste districts in Vermont sell. We buy them in bulk, so we're able to sell them at cost. So I would certainly reach out to your local waste district to see if they have this design available. You probably will be able to save some money on it. I like this design because it's open on the bottom, which really allows moisture and airflow to go right through the ground. And I just can't speak enough to the benefit of having your compost directly on the ground. It will thaw a little bit earlier in comparison to, say, a tumbler, which is lifted off the ground. And if it's too wet, the moisture will just be able to flow into the ground, which is huge. That's a really good benefit to the design. The green design in the corner is known as a green cone. This is really a digester. It's meant for meat, bones, and dairy. You open up the top, you put in bones or meat scraps, and you don't have to add in any brown materials, and molds will break it down. There's actually a basket underground that's about 2 feet deep underneath that green cone. And as materials break down, they simply digest into the ground, and you do not get a usable compost from this system. You don't harvest any compost from the ground underneath it. It's simply a method of digesting your food scraps, your meat, bones, and dairy in a controlled, odor-free way, because there's molds that break down in the material in that system. The tumbler, the blue tumbler in the bottom middle, a lot of people ask about tumblers. I personally have heard enough feedback from people in northern Vermont to think that maybe they are not the best system for a few reasons. One, they can become very heavy as they fill up with material over time. And so it's really important with a tumbler to get your ratio of greens and browns down so that as you put material in there, you promote airflow and it doesn't become just super, super heavy. If you have too much wet material in there, it will be very difficult to turn. I've also heard people say that some designs don't have enough air holes or water holes. If you do live in a dry place and you sometimes want rain to actually get into the tumbler, but that can be easily fixed enough. You certainly with those designs can add more holes for airflow as you need. They're obviously pretty animal proof because they're off the ground, which is a great part of the design. Certainly the soil saver, the black bin, is not animal proof. It can be tipped over by strong animals. The lid does lock in, so smaller animals will have a difficult time getting in there. But the tumbler is the most animal proof system that I have pictured here. Which certainly is a benefit. But I've heard people say that tumblers work best if they fill them up and then periodically empty out the contents, put the contents in a pile, maybe next to the tumbler to continue breaking down, which will free up space in the tumbler once it gets too heavy. And then everything will be sort of pre-composted by the time it's ready to take out. and then it won't attract as many animals once you remove it. And then finally, in the bottom, and by no means are these all the bin designs that are available, it's just some of the basic ones. On the bottom right, we have a 3-pallet system. This system would be pretty big for the average household, but it works really well because you just have ample space. So typically you'd build your compost pile in the first pallet. By the time it is full, you could either turn that material into the second pallet bin, or you could keep it there, turn it within the bay, and then begin you filling up the second one. And that basically means that you can have one bay of, maturing compost and one bay that you're actively filling up with material. And then typically the third bay is where you would store some of your dry brown carbon materials. After you've chosen what style bin you want or how you want to contain your pile, you want to think about where to place it. So you want to think about where is close enough to your home that it's accessible any time of the year, but not so close that if you were to have animal visitors that it would make you feel uncomfortable. We want to try to keep away animals as much as possible, but in the event that your neighborhood skunk visits your compost, what would be too close for comfort? So that's a good thing to think about. You really want to make sure it's on well-drained soil. So you don't want to put it on something that has very heavy clay soils. You really want to make sure that moisture and air can flow underneath the compost. You don't necessarily need to put your compost in the sun or in the shade. I would avoid putting it under large trees and shrubs, but it's not going to necessarily work slower if it's in the shade or super faster if it's in the sun. As your compost pile breaks down, it'll generate heat from inside the pile. So certainly sunlight will help, but it's not where the heat is coming from. And so if you have a very shaded backyard, don't think that because it's shady, you can't have a compost. You certainly can. You want to think about the capacity of your compost bin. The soil saver that's pictured with the orange glow is about 2.5 feet tall. And so if you fill that up about halfway, you're going to have a good amount of material in there to break down. You definitely don't want something that's too small. Too small, just as I mentioned in the video, won't provide enough material for your microorganisms to really break things down quickly. But you also don't want something that'll take 2 years for your family to fill. You want to consider how to store brown materials and keep them dry, but also close by. You want to think about how to animal-proof your design with hardware cloth, like I mentioned. If you use a soil saver, hardware cloth would go on the ground. But if you use a design that's made out of pallets, you could actually reinforce all the sides of that bin with hardware cloth. And that would really deter animals from being able to get in there. And you also want to think about ease of maintenance. How difficult would it be to get it into the compost and be able to turn it every once in a while? If you use a bin like a soil saver, that top completely is removable. So it's easy enough to get a pitchfork in there and turn material and agitate it a little bit. If you use a pallet system, obviously from the front, you can turn the material. And so those two designs are really easy to maintain. With the tumbler, like I mentioned, as it gets heavy, it actually might be a little bit difficult to turn. And so that definitely is a consideration. Now that we've looked at our backyard and we've thought about where we can build our compost pile that's well drained and accessible and we can store brown materials, we're going to look a little bit more at Composting Recipe. So just like I mentioned in the video, compost recipes often talk about the greens and the browns. The greens are what provide nitrogen to our composting microorganisms, while the browns are the ingredients that provide carbon to our composting microorganisms. And we know that as we build our pile, for every 1 gallon of wet and heavy greens, we want to add roughly 2, closer to 3 gallons of dry, woody browns that are going to promote airflow and balance out the moisture from our wet and heavy food scraps. And so greens include things, as we mentioned, like eggshells, fruit and veggie scraps, coffee grounds, tea bags, breads, pastas, grains, fresh grass clippings that are still green and full of moisture, and fresh animal manures. With the food scraps, there aren't really too many things we want to keep out except for meat, bones, and dairy. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You may want to consider removing PLU stickers from fruit and veggie peels if you don't want to have to pull those out in your finished compost. Sometimes tea bags are actually made of nylon for some of the fancier teas, so you may want to really take a look at what tea bags you're using and keep certain tea bags out, or you may want to remove the staple from tea bags, but coffee filters and tea bags are absolutely fine to add into compost. Some brown materials are things like wood chips, dry hay or straw, sawdust, shredded paper. All of these ingredients are dry and they'll promote airflow. Shredded cardboard is also good. And so these ingredients, I think it's really important to try to mix and match as many different brown materials as you can. If you have a lot of sawdust and you put only sawdust into your compost, that sawdust over time might become compressed within your compost as you build the pile. But if you mix that sawdust in with shredded hay, mulch hay, or some shredded paper or dried leaves, you're breaking up the sawdust enough so that it's not going to become compressed and still going to promote airflow. And so brown materials are really great to look at how many different varieties you have and mix them up as much as possible. Because, like I mentioned, for every 1 gallon of greens, you want 2, mostly 3 gallons of browns. So probably you'll want to find more than one source throughout the year to add into your compost for browns. So there are materials that we want to avoid adding into our compost. Now, I haven't said this yet, so I'll say it now. Nothing what I'm saying in this workshop is a rule. In my opinion, there are no, you can't do this or you have to do this with composting. It's all an experiment, but we do know that there are certain materials that will not help our composting experiment go well. These materials typically will produce odors, they won't break down quickly, they might upset the balance of microorganisms in our compost. So for example, things like meat, bones, dairy, and fish obviously will produce an odor as they break down. Our backyard compost isn't large enough to generate the amount of heat we need to really break those materials down fast and effectively. And so they will produce an odor and they will invite animals to your compost. Cooking oil is something that will really disrupt microbial populations in your compost because those are very water-loving bacteria. And so if you put too much cooking oil into your compost, you'll essentially drown out all the bacteria and they'll no longer be able to get oxygen. So you may end up with some nasty odors if you put too much oil in. Things like pet manures from meat-eating pets like cats and dogs should stay out. These typically have bacteria in them that aren't processed in our backyard compost. Sort of like meat, they would need a much higher temperature to really process that bacteria and sterilize the pet manures, basically. We would want to keep out things like glossy paper, anything that is a biodegradable plastic, especially biodegradable plastics, even though they say sometimes they're compostable, typically those materials are tested in very large industrial settings and will not break down in your compost pile. And we want to keep out weed seeds and diseased plants because we don't want to spread the disease through the compost, and we don't want to propagate weed seeds through our compost. And I don't have it on here, but I probably should add it to this. We also don't want to add in things like wood ash from wood burning stoves or lime. Both of these ingredients are relatively high in pH. They are more alkaline and our compost pile is somewhat on the acidic side. And so if we add in materials that are going to drastically change the pH of our compost, we run the risk of shocking our microorganisms, which would halt decomposition for a little bit, and then the pH would need to balance in the compost before all those microorganisms can reestablish and begin working quickly again. So if you compost at home, you can always put meat, bones, and dairy into the trash, even after July 1st, 2020, when the full food scrap ban comes into effect, because we don't want these materials in our backyard compost. You certainly can collect meat, bones, and dairy and bring it to your local recycling center for free composting, but if you, for whatever reason, choose not to do that, trash is certainly an appropriate option for those materials. And so water is a really important ingredient in our compost. And like I mentioned in the video, most of the water in our compost will come from the fruit and veggie scraps as those materials break down. I've heard some people say that when they collect their food scraps in the kitchen, they'll actually freeze them. This makes it so they don't cause odors in the house, until you bring them out. And then when you do bring them outside into the compost and they thaw, they release their moisture right away, and it speeds up the decomposition, jump starts it. And so if you have the space to freeze food scraps, I think that's a great idea. It's totally not necessary. Your food scraps still will release enough moisture as they break down to keep your compost pile like a wrung out sponge. And so remembering to stick to that 1 gallon of greens to 2 to 3 gallons of browns will really get you the ratio of moisture and airflow to keep your microorganisms as active as possible. So when we layer the backyard compost, just like I did in the video, we're layering it to ensure optimal airflow, moisture flow, and to make sure that our composting microorganisms have access to all the nutrients that they need right where they are. And so after we prep the soil layer by removing any grass, it's always recommended to put down some hardware cloth and then to have a nice big first layer of the hay, the straw, the leaves, other browns. And this will really help to promote airflow and balance out moisture. Then we can start adding in our food scraps. You certainly don't need to add in manures or finished compost, but if you put those materials on top of your food scraps, it'll really help to mitigate any odors. But if you don't have it, covering your food scraps with dry brown materials will also help to mitigate odors. I would never walk away from a compost with food scraps visible. If the food scraps are visible, then you know that the odors are going to be able to release from them out of the compost. But if you cover it up with especially sawdust and mulch hay, that'll really help to trap some of those odors. So your top layer of compost should always be a brown layer. And so the composting recipe, to dive a little bit deeper into that, we've already discussed a little bit about the 30-to-1 carbon-nitrogen ratio and about how I found that to be a really confusing thing to hear. Even when I was in college and I was studying science and I heard about that ratio, I thought, I'm never going to learn about compost. But one thing I love about science is that you can hear about it in sort of these really scientific terms, but we can also discuss how to apply that science in our own lives. And so to apply that 30-to-1 carbon-nitrogen ratio, we're going to do the 1 part green to 2 to 3 parts brown material, and we will end up with that ratio. And so we want that ratio because carbon is the energy source for bacteria and fungi. Of course, nothing would be able to work without an energy source, so carbon is extremely important. Nitrogen is just as important. It's necessary for building proteins and enzymes. And so we want to make sure we have enough nitrogen for our composting microbes to really repopulate and build proteins and enzymes as much as possible. So with a moisture level of a wrung out sponge, about 50 to 60%, we know that basically what's going on in our compost is this particle size image. right around all of our particles in our compost, there's a light layer of film, and that's where the bacteria is living, is in that liquid film layer that's on the outside of our food scraps, on the outside of wood chips and sawdust, wherever you put it. And then around that liquid film is where all the air space is. And so that air is going to allow oxygen to travel to the bacteria that live in that liquid film. And so it really is the perfect balance of air and moisture within our compost to support the composting microbes. So why our compost recipe matters, right? We want to keep our FBI, our fungal, bacterial, and insect agents strong in our compost, breaking down material as quickly as possible. The bacteria are going to be the most active microbes in our compost. They're the ones that are generating heat as they break down material. That heat is going to speed up decomposition. Depending on how hot your compost pile is, you may have different strains of compost, but really they're going to be the most active in the center of the pile. And we know that we keep them active by balancing out the carbon, the nitrogen, the air, and the water flow in our compost. And we know that if the air and the moisture flow halts and that our compost becomes too wet with no oxygen flowing through, our aerobic oxygen-loving bacteria will die and anaerobic bacteria strains will take over, and they are the ones that produce odors. And so we really want the aerobic bacteria strains in our compost. They should not be producing odors. The fungus breaks down woody materials, and it's important for the final stages of the compost. Once things really start to cool down and those larger woody materials still need to be broken up. The actinomycetes I could not find a cute picture for, but they are the visible grayish white strains that you see in your finished compost or your close to finished compost. And they're vital because they're really balancing out other bacterial strains because they produce antibiotics to really help take out any bacteria that you don't want in the compost. So they are a great sign. And the worms that come into your compost, you do not need to add worms to your compost. They will find their way from the environment. And there are typically just earthworms that will live in your compost. And they'll really help to promote the moisture and airflow as they tunnel through the pile. If you want to compost with worms inside of your house, that is a different species of worms. Those are red wigglers. The earthworms we find outside in Vermont do not want to be contained in a small bin indoors. So please don't go out and find some and make a worm bin using those earthworms. The worms that are used in vermicomposting are much smaller and they really don't mind living in a confined space. Again, they're called red wigglers. So now let's think about the timeline of compost. So this timeline I created assuming that we're starting a pile in the spring. Right now, as I'm doing this recording, it's May, so it's a great time of the year to clean up leaf and yard waste and to start a new pile. So we're going to start a pile, theoretically, by layering all of our materials, the wood chips, the shredded paper, the hay, and our food scraps. So we start the pile in the spring, and we would expect within the first few weeks that our compost microorganisms are going to start becoming active. They will break down food waste, they'll start generating heat, and that will really speed things up. As they break down all the food waste in the center of the pile and they run out of a food source, they'll start to cool down about after a month or so. And so now would be a great time to go and turn the pile to make sure that any food scraps on the outer edge of the pile make their way into the center and to really promote airflow. But really you want to make sure that any food scraps that aren't in the center can make their way in there. You want to give those microorganisms a new source of food, and then their temperature, the temperature of the pile will increase again. And so then you want to continue doing that, continue layering material in your pile every so often, turning your pile with a pitchfork to make sure it's not producing odors, to make sure it looks like it's just wet enough but not too wet. And then In the fall, you may find that you have a good amount of material in your pile and what's at the bottom looks done. You can remove this compost and put it in another bin or under a tarp for a few months and allow it to cure. Because even though this compost looks finished, there are still nutrients being processed by the microorganisms, and studies have shown that it takes about 2 or so months from the point that the compost appears finished to actually balance out all the nitrogen and carbon that's left over in the pile. So while it's not necessary to cure, it certainly is a benefit because we want to add stable compost to our garden. If you put it on as soon as it looks complete, a lot of the nutrients will be leached out of the material by rain. And so we want to allow it to cure. And so if you do that in the fall, it'll actually free up space for you to continue building your compost pile throughout the winter. In the winter, our compost will not break down. The materials will freeze. But our frozen food scraps typically won't create odors, and so you don't need to worry about animals the same way that you do in the summer and in the warmer months. But you want to continue layering your greens and your browns so that as soon as your compost pile thaws in the spring, all you need to do is turn the pile to reintroduce airflow, look at how moist the pile is, and add any water or dry ingredients as necessary to get the 50 to 60% moisture level. Composting in bear country. So this is a pretty big deal in Vermont. I hear a lot of questions about how to keep away animals from a compost, but even more so how to keep away bears. And so what I will say about this is that it is obviously much easier to deter smaller critters from our compost bin. If you have that unit I mentioned earlier, the soil saver, smaller raccoons won't be able to push that over, but a bear certainly will. And so it is a little bit harder to find a regular design that you can purchase in a store that is bear-proof. If you really want a bear-proof design, you should consider building something that's durable and that has a lid. And certainly you would still want to use hardware cloth on something that you build yourself to keep away smaller critters. But bears, just like any other animal, are going to be attracted by scent. And so making sure to have an ample supply of brown materials to cover your food scraps is essential. It's essential not only for your microorganisms to give them what they need, the carbon and the nitrogen, but it's essential to keep animals away because it will cover any odors. And so a thick layer of browns is going to really help keep the bears away. And you want to mix and turn your pile because if your pile is too wet, the odors that are created in the pile will also attract bears. So the biggest thing that you can do is to have enough browns and to mix and turn it. Of course, you will also want to keep out the meat and the bones and the dairy items. They'll absolutely be attracted to those scents. And remember that you do have options. If you are experiencing issues with a bear, I would recommend collecting your food scraps for the time and bringing it to your local recycling center or transfer station for a drop-off. You may find that that's a good alternative when bears are waking up from hibernation and getting ready to go into hibernation, when they're really active and there isn't enough food out in the wilds for them. You may find that it feels most comfortable for you to just go to a recycling center with your food scraps at that time. So that certainly is an option. And remember, if you have issues with bears, you can report it to the Vermont Fish and Wildlife. They want to hear about your concerns. Last year in 2019, I heard that they had about 1,000 concerns come in about bears in compost piles. And so this is something that happens quite a bit, but it can be mitigated and there are ways to keep bears away from your compost. Chickens. A lot of people ask about composting with chickens. They are a great way to take your food scraps, feed it to your livestock. It makes the eggs a little bit more nutritious. There have been some studies that show that the eggs are just as nutritious as grain-fed hen eggs and actually have slightly higher contents of certain proteins. And so it is a very beneficial feed for them. And so if you were to do this, you would simply feed chickens your food scraps, allow them to forage it for a day or two. Whatever they choose not to eat can be removed from their coop and placed into a pile. And maybe you also would want to put in some chicken manure and shavings into that pile once they've already scratched everything up. And so everything is already all mixed up with the manures. The chickens have gotten everything they want from it, and then that material is perfectly ready for a compost. Some people have asked about chickens and composting in the winter. If you have a coop that has ample space to allow you to layer your bedding throughout the winter, it's really great to feed food scraps, some food scraps, maybe not a lot, to chickens right in their coop. Cover it with bedding after a few days and continue layering their bedding. Once their bedding is about 1.5 feet tall or so, it'll start to generate heat, which will keep the chicken coop slightly warmer than the air temperatures outside. It's called the deep litter method, and you can do it with or without food scraps, but certainly in the winter, if you had some veggie peels that you could throw in, the chickens would enjoy that, and then it would just be mixed in right with the rest of their deep litter. So a little bit about common myths. We've already talked about a lot of this stuff, but just to go over some of it quickly. Compost piles are hard and need to be turned often. This, I would say, is a myth. Composting can be as easy or as hard as you want it to be. If you layer your materials and really stick to that 1 to 3 greens to browns ratio, you're setting yourself up for having to do minimal maintenance, because you know that air will flow through the pile, that moisture will be balanced as things break down, and really you'll want to just check on the pile and turn it every so often. If you have a very large compost pile, maybe you have a lot of animal manures, you'll need to turn the pile more often. So the larger the pile, the more work it takes, because the faster material will break down. You don't need to add water to your compost pile, especially in a moist climate like Vermont, because moisture from fruits and vegetables and coffee grounds will be enough to maintain that moisture ratio that you want of 50 to 60%. You do not need to add any compost starter or amendments to your pile to get the pile to start working faster or to enrich it with nutrients. Everything that your compost pile needs is in your composting ingredients. All the bacteria already exist on our fruit waste and on the leaf and yard waste. All the nutrients are already locked within our food waste. And so you certainly don't need to add anything other than your greens and browns. And compost piles smell bad. That certainly sometimes can be true, but it's also mostly a myth. If your compost pile is active and working well, there should be no odors that are coming from it. It should actually smell more like a sweet, earthy scent, like when you're walking through the woods. And that smell is coming from those actinomycetes, the gray-white strand that you see throughout the compost. So if your compost smells bad, remember, something is up with it that's causing it to smell bad. And let's look at that just a little bit deeper. And so I love this little image. It says, tip compost should not stink. If you have to peg your nose to get to your compost, something is not right. And so if your compost has a strong odor, remember that is a sign that something is not working efficiently. It may be too wet, and which would hinder air from flowing through to the composting microorganisms. If it's too dry, your composting microorganisms are going to dry out and die. So they might not be actively breaking things down. And so if you smell something like rotten eggs, that may tell me that the compost is too wet and air can't flow through it. But if you smell something like ammonia, nitrogen coming off of your pile, then you know that your compost doesn't have enough carbon, because your bacteria are going to work through your carbon and your nitrogen as quickly as they can, but once they run out of a carbon source, they can't break down the nitrogen anymore. And so if they have no carbon, that's when you start to smell the nitrogen volatilizing into the air from the compost. And so the different smells might help you figure out how to balance your ratio. If you have any questions about this and you can't figure it out, please feel free to reach out to us here at the Waste District. We would love to help you break down what's going on in your pile and figure out how to adjust it. And so lastly, if your compost pile attracts animals, their animals are attracted to scent. Of course, they have other senses, but typically scent is their strongest sense. And so really making sure you have all the browns you need to cover up the greens and making sure that you're not putting in meat, bones, and dairy is going to go a really long way. We hope you enjoyed today's backyard composting workshop. If you have any questions or need something clarified, please reach out to my email here, outreach@nekwmd.org. Our website, nekwmd.org, also has a lot of information on backyard composting, so feel free to check that out. Have a great day.